Good morning. My name is Margon and I'm from the Green Team, and I would like to tell you a story. This story is called The Frog Hunt, and it's from Africa. So once upon a time there was a king, and he ruled from the mountains in the north all the way across the savannah to a wetland in the south. And round the wetlands is where he lived with his tribe. And in the wetland, lots of animals lived there as well. And some of the animals were frogs. And every afternoon or late evening, frogs would appear and would start making a lot of noise in the wetland. And they would go ribbit, ribbit, ribbit in the afternoon and in the evening. And most people quite liked the frogs. They fell asleep to the sound of the frogs. And it was part of their natural day and saying that the day was coming to an end. The only person that did not like the frogs and the noise that they made was the king. He hated them. And many evenings he could not fall asleep because of the sound of the frogs. Or some nights he would be wide awake after a dream or a nightmare. And again, he couldn't get back to sleep for the sound of the frogs. So one night, after a particularly bad dream, he couldn't fall asleep and the frogs kept him awake, and he shouted, "Be quiet!" to the frogs, and they didn't listen. They just kept ribbiting, ribbiting, ribbiting on. And the rest of the night he thought how he was going to get rid of them. And by dawn, he had a plan. He realised how he could get rid of the frogs. So he called all his people together and he said, "Who's the ruler of this land?" "Well, you are, your majesty." "And who's the ruler of all the animals?" "You are, your majesty." "I command you to get rid of these frogs. Kill them, drive them out, get your clubs, hit them, get your nets, catch them. And by evening, I do not want to hear a single frog in this wetland." Okay, well, people went into their houses and got clubs, they got sticks, they got nets, and they were either killing the frogs or catching them and releasing them somewhere else. The only person that did not help with the frog hunt was an old lady. And she was watching everybody doing it. And the king walked up to her and said, "Well, it's not really a job for you." And the old woman looked to the king and said, "Well, it's not because I'm old or a woman or frail that I'm not taking part in the frog hunt. It's because I think you're making a mistake." Said the king. "What does she know?" And she said, "Mind my words, you will learn a lesson from this," and then walked off. And the king just thought, well, what does she know? She's just an old woman. I'm the king. I know what I'm doing. So by evening, the king was sitting outside his hut and listening out for the sound of frogs. Not a sound to be heard. It was silent. Just some birds and some crickets, and that was it, and cicadas. No sound of frogs, and the king felt satisfied that it was achieved what he'd asked. And again, the following day, no sound of the frogs. And it continued. And people started getting used to the quietness of the swamp. More days passed, and then suddenly a different sound was heard, a slightly higher pitched sound, and it was mosquitoes arrived. The swamp was a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. And because there was no frogs to eat them, the mosquitoes laid their eggs and they multiplied and multiplied and multiplied in numbers. But after a week, the whole swamp and wetland was buzzing with mosquitoes, and they slowly started to get into the huts of people where they were, and they got into their hair and scratching and itching. Oh, and it was getting quite uncomfortable. And even the animals were getting bothered by the mosquitoes. So people started to complain to the king and said, "Please do something. The mosquitoes are horrendous." So king called everybody back together again and said, "I command you to kill the mosquitoes, just like you did the frogs." If you try to swat a fly, it's very difficult. So people got their clubs and their nets. But the nets, the holes were too big. They couldn't catch the mosquitoes. And slowly, instead of people remaining there and swatting the mosquitoes, people were starting to pack their bags because it was becoming unbearable to live next to the swamp. And people started to leave their village. So that after a few more days and weeks passed, was only the king and the old woman left. And the old woman stood there with the king next to the swamp, and he said, "Look, I hope you have learned your lesson. You know, the swamp is full of mosquitoes and you have an empty village. You know, this is what's happened." And the king just looked at her and shook his head, and he realized that he had learned his lesson. So what lesson did the king learn? Well, he learned that everything is connected. By killing one thing, it has a knock-on effect to something else. So he realized everything in nature is connected, and we are connected to nature as well.